And this last panel is going to be on utilizing the right metrics and technology to deliver value for users and the business. And I want to welcome Shailesh to the
Chris,
stage.
I took over for Shailesh.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah.
Hello, who are you?
Chris
Hi,
Chabot.
I'm Tiana.
Hi, Tiana.
Nice to meet you. Let's keep nimble.
Surprise.
Okay, and with that, I'll hand over to you.
Awesome, thank you. So we are here with a wonderful panel who I hope are coming up to stage anytime soon. Yes, they are. Fantastic. That will make the session a lot better. So we are talking about how to use metrics to get to success, basically. And we're joined by three awesome product people who shouldn't stand in front of speakers like that. Who have a lot of experience in very different kind of businesses and different parts of the life cycle of a business as well. So with that, I am Chris Chabot. I have about 25 years of experience building products, mostly developer focused, but various product roles. Worked at companies like Google, Twitter, Amazon, and currently at a fantastic startup called Sendbird. Sendbird does in-app chat, so if you ever talk to someone on Hinge, or talk to your delivery driver, or chat with someone on Reddit, you probably use Sendbird without even knowing it. So with that, Robert, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm Rob. I've been doing product for about 15 years, mostly focused on consumer, so Zipcar, LastMinute.com, Moonpig. So I've sold cars, Christmas cards and then most recently massages at Urban, a wellness marketplace. And that's about me. And most recently I'm at Home Hero, which is an app for renters. And I guess interestingly, we've pivoted and changed, so I'm back to a team of one. So I've taken a massive change in direction. We essentially pivoted, no more team, just me in product and design. Really fun actually, just going back to, no one else to shout at now, just me. So
You get all the credit, but all the blame.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Sarum, do you want to go next?
Hi, I'm Sarum. I'm the co-founder and chief product officer at Quit Genius. So Quit Genius is a digital platform to help people conquer their addiction. We operate in a B2B2C market, predominantly selling in the US to employers, health insurers, as like a cost-saving reduction and getting access to their employees and getting them on board to a journey of hopefully being addiction-free lives. By background, I'm a doctor, so started the product journey about 5 years ago. We're basically at Quit Genius, and we're now kind of in that scale-up mode, going to about 8 to 10 squads. So hopefully less shouting at myself and more shouting at other people.
Very good. Sagar, do you want to go next?
Hi everyone, Sagar Baines. I'm the head of product at The Body Coach. You may have heard of The Body Coach. Oh, my mic's going. We are a fitness and nutrition wellbeing organisation fronted by a chap called Joe Wicks, who you may all see on social media. And within the organisation, we do a number of different things. We have recipe books, we have podcasts, TV documentaries, and then we have the digital app, which is a weight loss transformation product, helping users start their journey into fitness and nutrition, and ultimately, hopefully, achieve a physical transformation and also a mental health transformation off the back of that as well. I have been doing product tech stuff now for about 15 years. I also went to medical school, but I got kicked out because I was too busy DJing and partying. So I lasted a couple of years there. And then I found my way into technology, did some big consultancy stuff, then worked in startups, and now work with Joe and the team.
So now we know that if someone goes, is there a doctor in the house? We're going to be just fine.
Don't come to me.
Don't come to you, exactly. So I guess we start at the beginning of a life cycle of a company's journey, because we're talking about metrics today, right? And metrics are incredibly important in increasing efficiency, finding product market fit, all those different aspects of a business. But there are parts in the life cycle where you do not have a sufficient number of customers or visitors to really be able to delve into useful data. Because if you have 2 visitors, that's not going to give you anything statistically significant, right? So Robert, you mentioned that there's currently you in the team.
Yep.
So that's a pivoting startup, trying to find product market fit. How do you work around that problem? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. So I think it's still keeping everything structured, so you don't have a lot of data coming in. You can't make those decisions, but it's still about getting out there, getting qualitative data, but still keeping it very focused, still trying to prove hypotheses. So I guess we've got a growth process in place at the moment, where we're trying out different channels. We're making sure that the messages are consistent across all of those channels. And we're gathering that data and feedback, with salespeople going out. I'm sort of even getting on, I'm getting on the phone, doing sales calls, doing all the rest of it, which I think is an interesting bit. We were talking about walking the floors yourself. Don't trust anyone because you need to be out there. So it's about really keeping a very structured process, even with the qualitative data. And then I think another bit is just get something out there that you can get some data from. So, really going top of funnel, let's put some ads out there and see if we're getting click-throughs to the next stage, then push it down the next level. So it's just really about that. What can you do? And, we release products, using no-code type solutions as quickly as possible with the smallest, these are MVPs, but we can knock them up in a week or two. Don't put the brand name on it. And we're just testing that to see if people actually start using it, gather feedback. Is this one particular feature that they like? And I think it's also challenge in that is like throwing away your pride that you want this beautiful, amazing product that's there. But people will, I'm sure you've probably, started yourself, kind of seen that people do engage with things and you've got this amazing idea, but it's just kind of throwing that all away and being, open and honest with yourself that this idea might be rubbish and just learning as quickly as possible. So
yeah, and that's I think one of the challenges a lot of founders face is that you start with an idea and you feel emotionally committed and connected to it. Being able to let go and pivot away from that is tough. What is also tough is how do you communicate that to your stakeholders? What kind of data do you use for that?
Yeah, so I did an investor call this morning. I think it's bringing all of that qualitative feedback. There's a load of research about this at the market, etc. But also just bringing in real world feedback from people you're interviewing or these potential customers, and really bringing that to life. Because I think someone talking to someone else or hearing that feedback in person can be a lot better than numbers sometimes. It just brings that emotional connection. It's like, this is something that will really change my life. Now, one conversation can be better than, a big old dashboard of numbers.
Yeah.
And I think it's something we mentioned earlier when we're talking about putting the customer first. I think we're talking about your engineering manager not wanting to put the customer first. Stick them in the room with someone who's really upset. It'll probably change their mindset. It's just, there's an emotional piece as well. So, I think that explains it.
And do you ever use like recordings of Zoom calls or interviews or?
Yeah, so we've got a kind of good process in place. We record all the calls, we share it with the team. There's a Slack channel there. Every week we have a feedback session. I'm getting everyone in the whole team to join those Zoom calls, get them to summarize that. We probably have about 10 calls with everyone, potential customers every week. We put the sales calls, they're doing cold calls, just, that's probably the acid test. Is this idea working? If someone will talk to you for longer than 2 minutes when they're getting a cold call. Putting those in there, getting the team to cold call. It's like, so getting everyone, and the head of engineering wandering around, trade fairs, and probably the worst salespeople in the world. But it's that kind of thing that brings you closer and brings all that feedback and engagement into the product.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I found the same thing as well. Once people see a recording of a human being, everything changes with the perception. So moving on from there, we found product market fit, you understand that there's a customer base and cool stuff starts to happen, then at some point you need to figure out how to optimize your business and go from startup to scale up, right? So Sagar, as I understand, you guys are kind of in the process of doing that right now.
Yeah, I think
how did you change your metrics? Did you change your metrics in that process?
I would say we're in a slightly strange position where we've got a well-established brand, but a very new product that sits within it. Product's only been live now for coming up to 2 years, 2-year anniversary next week, actually. And from a metrics point of view, for the first year, I'd say, we were pretty blind from a metrics point of view. The product was put together by an agency. Analytics got de-scoped. You know the story, how it goes. So we've brought that in. And now we're at a stage where I guess we've got the luxury of got thousands of users. We've got a lot of quant data now coming in. And we're trying to really, I would say, if I'm being totally honest, like work out, like, are we thinking about the right numbers? We're lucky it's a subscription business, right? So it's simple, it's acquisition and retention.
Yes.
So we're pretty clear about the numbers we need to move on the onboarding funnel side and on the 1 month and yearly retention. And then we're at the next stage now of saying, what are the right proxy measures for that?
Yeah.
You made me think though, because one thing we're guilty of is we have a massive community. So 10 million people on social media. We have Facebook groups that spin up themselves and moderate themselves talking about our product.
Yeah.
And I think we've become a little bit lazy in just relying upon that. So we're not talking to customers enough. Emma will probably kill me for saying that, but I don't think we are. I think we rely too much upon just browsing our own communities and looking at that. Like you can't stop doing that.
I mean, the thing is, that's really right. Like, I look back and some of the other things, and I was relying, we had, loads and loads of data, tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of users, and it was really easy to sit there and like, oh, we can move this metric. And if you don't get out the building and really talk to people, so that's kind of given me a good kick up the.
Yeah. So Sarim, for your business, you mentioned you're working with insurance companies, selling to large companies that deploy this as a program for the employees. I imagine your world looks different because there's a multitude of stakeholders that all have very different interests. So given what you've just heard from your colleagues here, how does your take on the world differ?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've gotten a better understanding of our metrics, and we have a pretty clear mission of how do we help 100 million people conquer their addiction, and naturally that success metric is how good are we actually getting people to addiction-free lives, kind of using substances in a healthy way or being abstinent completely. But as you go through the product and you get a variety of members kind of coming through the door with different views on where they want to be from a goals perspective, you realize at times your goals and their goals differ, and like their view of success is very different to your view of success. And a great example is with our alcohol product. We have alcohol's a pretty big spectrum of like healthy to unhealthy use, and people often don't know where they lie on that healthy to unhealthy use. And we have a pretty strong view of where people should be, but if we kind of push that view too strongly, too early in the product funnel, you get resistance, you get disengagement over time. And so for us, it's how do we tailor the experience, knowing that someone is coming in with 50 standard drinks per week. They want to get down to 40, but actually we want to get them down to 10, 15. How do we really think about...
I can see how people would respond to that.
Exactly. Like there's a big fear factor of going and creating that big of a behavior change.
Yeah.
And so it's how do you kind of motivate someone to really understand the benefits of going down that change, educating them of what healthy versus unhealthy looks like, understanding their misconceptions of like why they fear this big change so much, and also just building up trust over time, knowing that you don't have to get them to that goal on day one. You can kind of get them over time towards that North Star goal. And why that's important is because our outcomes are directly correlated to cost savings, which is ultimately what our customers care most about. And so we over time need to get members to a certain threshold so that we can show our customers that we're delivering dollar value to their businesses, and that's ultimately what they care about. So there is that kind of way up of like how do we get them to their goals but also our goals so that we can kind of continue to show that B2B success at the same time.
But at least they don't conflict with each other, right? Like lowering the alcohol intake means your customers are happier as well. So
exactly.
That helps a little bit with the balance, because I can imagine if you were working with people who said like, no, I love these people coming by every week and giving me money, it becomes a lot more complicated. So do you have those kind of factors in your industry, like doctors saying, please keep these people addicted so I can keep getting my fees? Or
luckily, no.
Does that ever come up? No?
Not in that sense, but we do have a human part of the product and a digital experience. So the digital experience is made up of kind of self-paced educational content. We have the ability to track progress, track your medication usage, but then we have a network of hundreds of providers, coaches, counselors, and so that human part of the experience, you can't standardize the quality all the time, and especially as you're scaling, there's kind of supply and demand issues. There's a case of like they play a big role in like product satisfaction, product outcomes. And so how do you really internally evangelize some of the product metrics so that their view of success is the same as yours at the same time as well? Because doctors have a very different background. They come in with their own views, and every time you change their tools, like they may go one or two different ways, and it's kind of how do you internally evangelize that new version of doing things, which can be sometimes quite resistant to change.
Yeah, that's definitely like any change is psychological pain, as they say, right? So that's always hard to get done. And one of the interesting things that I think you brought up is that people's perceptions around problems are different from how you would express it in data, perhaps, right? For instance, with addiction, it can be a lifestyle. People think that it's cool to use whatever substance they use, right? So you're not just battling the physiological aspects, but also the mental imagery that people associate with things. And sociology is always hard to understand unless you're in that position yourself. And we see the same thing with data, where sometimes you see a number move severely in one or two directions. You don't necessarily understand where it comes from. What do you do in this situation? Like you've got quite a few data points, right? So how do you go from a number in your dashboard to meaning and understanding?
So we're trying to put some rigor around this really at the moment. We're lucky to have those numbers in place. And to your point, like we might see our annual retention number move from month to month. But there are some, when you take a step back, there are some really obvious things that affect our business. And that's kind of formed the foundation of how we look at the numbers and the lenses we apply to our numbers. I think of it as a framework. So every time I see a number, I'm like, right, there's almost a checklist in my head of here are the kind of 7 big things that affect all of our numbers. We're a fitness business, so seasonality is massive. What people do in January is completely different to what they do in October. So first question is like, what cohort are these users in? Where do they sit? We're also a mass market product, price sensitive audience, like I said, what it is in this day and age, but we're always running promotions typically at different parts of the year, not just your Black Friday, but we try to run a summer promotion. So again, that's another lens we're looking at, because we know that if someone signs up during a promotional window, it affects their retention and their behavior and their time to first work out, all of these different things. So all of those lenses, those are just 2, I guess we're trying to really establish them as an actual framework or a checklist, to keep it simple, to be honest, which is like, okay, take a step back. Where were we in the year? Who is this type of user? How did they sign up via a promotion or not? What's their ability? So we see massive changes in ability from someone who's a beginner user to an advanced user, and logically just work through that. And only at that point, I think that's probably stage 1. The second part is then just laying on the qual as well and looking at that, looking at the data and saying, well, that's not behaving. We've been through our checklist and it's still not going where we think it is, and then trying to look back at the qual and see if we can tie anything up there.
Yeah.
As well.
Cool, that makes sense. Yeah, and data is always tricky, right? You can't improve what you don't measure, as people would say. At the same time, I remember this story from way back in the day. I was talking with Marissa Meyer. She told me a story of how they used page views as an indication of measuring success of the search engine. And it turned out that every time that number went up, they actually made the search engine worse, because you had to go to the next page to find your results. Right, so it totally backfired on them. They totally had to pivot away from that. So once you choose a metric to follow, it becomes a goal that people strive towards rather than success for the business in a way. So Robert, you mentioned you've done this for 15 years. I'm sure you've seen this situation a couple of times. What are some of your learnings there?
Yeah, I mean, I guess an interesting one, kind of when talking about marketplaces and managing the supply and the demand. I think there's a couple of lessons as we revamped our ratings and review system. And obviously, I think that was coming from the practitioners who obviously shout the loudest, and they are a scarce resource, so you're trying to keep them on board. They obviously all want amazing reviews. They want to be 5-star, and they complain if they get anything lower. So we revamped, I guess, our kind of, key metrics were, like their NPS and their engagement and the number of hours that they were putting on. So it was very much focused on that. I mean, and one of this, and I think this is kind of the key point, is like looking at those counter metrics, so always having another metric that lives with your other one, and they might not be something that you would expect. This one, you would expect it, but essentially, we revamped the rating system. We pushed up all of their reviews. They all looked really great. They're all 5-star. Conversion rate goes slightly down because obviously they all look exactly the same. So we don't want to kind of affect the other side by, asking people to give them bad reviews. So it's just, then it's looking at something else. It's like, so we found, their NPS is up, their hours are up, they're not getting as many bookings, so now they're getting angry. What can we do to make sure that both of those metrics are up there? And I mean, it's a really simple kind of solution that we came up with was, putting promoted reviews at the top of their portal. They were really happy. They could say, this is my favorite one, this is my favorite one. They come up the top, differentiates them from the other 5-star person. So it's just kind of looking at that and making sure that you're tracking all of the metrics at the same time. And I guess that's, and I guess one where we try that. But,
Sanity check for having multiple perspectives of looking at the data, seeing if they match up against each other.
And fix it later, and like try and see, can you get another solution? Don't just throw it out the window and start again.
And how do you go about getting buy-in to those metrics from the different stakeholders? Because you're dealing with board of directors or investors, your engineering directors, your fellow PMs. They might all have a different view of what success looks like and how you measure that. So how do you socialize that in a way that people go, this is our North Star?
I mean, I think it's making sure that it's always aligned with your strategy. I think it's often easier with investors where if you can tie it back to a metric that works for them. Are we going for growth? Are we going for profitability? Anything like that. So if you can tie that back up to what they believe is the goal, they do believe that is the goal. But essentially, I think for me, it's always like trying to tie it back to an individual, or really understanding what their motivation is within the company, what their goals are, and then just having individual conversations with people to really bring them along. Talk to everyone before you get in the room is kind of my ethos. So you never kind of go in and just say, this is what we're doing. So I think it's just really getting that buy-in individually where you can from the right people. And if it's the wrong thing, then that's what you're learning along the way as well. Don't just do something because you think it's right. You don't just need buy-in. You're often wrong most of the time. So
Sarim, I imagine that coming from a medical world, goal setting might be different, right? Between being a product officer versus being a medic. I imagine in healthcare, you don't use quarterly goals and objectives. Do you do that in your current business though? Using OKRs?
Yeah.
So how do you translate the goals of where you would like to see your metrics go to quarterly plans?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we still use OKRs and that's kind of been the central way of kind of tracking progress. I think, early on we heavily leaned upon kind of clinical research to kind of inform that strategy, understand, with these outcomes, like this is where we're working towards. But as we evolved, it kind of started with like, how do we set a company strategy, a product strategy that aligns like where we want to be over the next 12 months. And then you kind of build up a strategic narrative of like, why is this metric important? And that storytelling piece becomes important as you speak to a number of different execs. And then as you look to break that down, it's kind of how do you make the right trade-offs within the different quarters and understand, within Q1, like how you kind of focus. And that's something that we're going through at the moment. And obviously there's naturally like a lot of debate as to everyone has a vested interest in product. And so knowing what metric is most important to each exec and being able to communicate it in a way that ladders up to the metric that they care about feels like the biggest game changer is like, if we're focusing on outcomes, that has an effect because it drives dollar value for our SVP of sales. But if we're focused on year 2 retention, that is great for our client success team because they care about retention of clients. And so it's kind of translating some of those metrics and some of those OKRs into like business impact so that you can kind of get that buy-in. And then outside of like OKRs, it's a case of making sure that you're also nimble. Like we don't want to kind of be too set in what we're trying to achieve. And as you go through each of the quarters, you learn so much, and knowing that the real like priority is keeping open communication lines with your stakeholders so that they can kind of respond to what you're hearing on the ground.
Yeah. Yeah, and you mentioned storytelling, which is such an important tool for the kind of work that we do, right? And one of the tensions that can sometimes exist is, say, that you have an engineering team and they feel passionate about the technical problem they're solving, and they see that as the most important thing to finish that. Whereas your product's priorities might be completely different. Improvements in that area are not going to drive more revenue or retention, whereas this new thing is critical for our success. How do you take people along in that? How do you change your storytelling to get your engineering team or your design team or your customer success team to join you in that change of direction?
Yeah, I mean, luckily, we start off by just aligning on, product design, engineering are three equal pillars to kind of solving these problems, and they all play different roles in different areas of ownership, but it's all very collaborative. And for us to be successful, everyone kind of needs to be working in sync. And then as we work towards certain kind of member goals, it's a case of like, how do we first drive positive feedback loops around, engineering built this, and this is the effect that it ended up happening. So as we think about the next initiative we want to take on board, here's why we think it's going to have an impact. And it's the same thing with, driving innovations and trying to address technical debt. It's kind of how does that relate back to the member, because ultimately like that's what's most important to the business and that's what's most important to the product. And if you can kind of present it in those terms, that's where we want to be.
Exactly.
And really like they're partners, so they should be brought in as early as possible into that problem solving piece. Like you want them to have ownership of the problem, feel like they can go about solving it and be almost challengers to some of the product initiatives that we're taking on board.
Yeah, and they can recognize how their work contributes to that success, which is important, absolutely. So you mentioned that you used an agency for the first version of the digital app. That implies that you've got your own engineers working that now?
We have, we've been building the in-house team.
How's that process been? So I imagine it started with, what were these idiots thinking? That was probably day one, right? So how do you go from there?
So I came in as employee number one on the tech side of the in-house team, and the agency was still a 40-person team, like strong at that point. And then we've begun, ramping off down the team and building up our team. So we've been in hiring mode for 9 months now, continually just interviewing and bringing engineers in. The analytics bit was one of the major gaps. I think I don't know if anyone else had the experience, but agencies are there to build the first version, get it out the door, and then typically they move on. Things like analytics, things like observability, operational elements to the product were just all missing. There was no data analyst in the team when I joined. And it was doubly frustrating because we have all these users. We're lucky we got this brand, but we didn't have a bloody clue what they were doing. So priority number one was just a quick fix, like how do we get some data in here? So we brought in a contractor data analyst, spun up a BigQuery warehouse, very quickly just tried to get some numbers into here, which could then steer some of the roadmap conversations that we were having. Up to that point, prior to that point, like there was limited data, but again, like nothing compared to I'd say what we have now and the sophistication of the setup that we have now.
So you didn't even have like performance data of how quickly stuff loaded or any of that stuff?
Basic stuff, I'd say, certainly some crash reporting around quality, things like that. Limited performance stuff, I would say. But that's common with agencies, right? I think,
Absolutely.
I'm happy to be
corrected by... But it doesn't mean you're sailing blind.
Yeah.
That's intense, yeah.
Definitely. Now we're in a world where we have a much richer set of analytics. We're still not quite there. We don't have full coverage of all parts of the product, but we can make much more informed decisions around what we're prioritizing.
And I imagine that you're dealing with founders or owners of a company who got used to the way that the agency worked in some ways. They probably recognized that there were problems, but there's an education aspect, I assume, as well.
Most definitely, yeah.
So how do you go about doing that?
So our founders are non-technical. They don't come from this world, and
Are they from a fitness background?
Journalism and fitness. Joe's
that's
fitness.
pretty
Nikki's
good.
more
Yeah.
journalist background. But they, I mean, we're lucky. Like they're very receptive to this stuff. But really taking a step back, like introducing them, like why bother with metrics? You know,
Yeah.
like what does this typically look like? What does good look like in another scenario? And then kind of working backwards from there and saying, painting a really vivid picture, really trying to take out the technical language around it and saying, like, you know, in 3 months' time, we want to be in a position where when we're having a conversation about prioritizing these two things, I'm going to have these metrics in front of you.
Yeah.
And I'll be able to show you
Awesome.
time to first workout, number of workouts completed this week, average number of workouts per user, that kind of thing. So almost mocking up a scenario, really, of what it was
Yeah.
going to look like. As well as then an education piece then on the tooling, like what does it look like? What does it cost? What's the level of effort to implement this stuff? So yeah, I'd say like just really stripping it back and trying to paint that picture for them is
What an
important.
awesome challenge, though. That must have been challenging but fun.
It was, but you know, credit to them, they make my life easy.
Awesome.
They recognize the value of it.
So in building that trust is definitely a skill to have. So well done on that. Yeah. So one of the things that I personally enjoy in metrics, like I've worked on a number of social networks like Google Plus and Twitter and a couple of others you might not have heard of. The thing that fascinated me is that at some point you can go, if someone sets their profile photo and has 3 friends, they are likely to become a long-term user, 90% certainty. Whereas if they don't do that and they only have 2 friends, 90% certainty they're going to drop off. Like data at some point surprises you, right? The insights you can generate from that. So Robert, have you ever had that kind of a situation where you go like, oh, didn't expect that that's the thing I would learn here?
Didn't prep for this one, did I?
I'm sorry.
I'm joking. I think so. I mean, definitely. I just try to, off the top of my head, in that massage world with therapists, it was definitely after about the 3rd or 4th booking that they had on the platform, so they could wait around for 5 days. They wouldn't drop off, and then, but they would drop off. They could have 1 or 2 bookings and they would still leave. But as soon as they had the 3rd one, they were kind of engaged. They were getting enough money, and then it was on to utilization. So I think it's kind of just looking for those. It's just really digging through the data, trying to understand those drop-off points. Yeah, that was, I guess, one of them. And then just driving behavior and incentives to keep them on. So it's after first 3 bookings, we'll discount so you can get booked quicker and faster, etc. Just looking
Here's
at
a
those
25% discount so we can get you to 4 and increase
Exactly,
the
yeah,
likelihood
yeah.
of.
Yeah.
Very clever.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I personally find fascinating, that sometimes you get to insights that you can't reason yourself to because you don't understand what's happening exactly, but it turns out that that's exactly where that chasm is. So I imagine that in challenging addictions, you see a lot of those kind of things in real life as well. What has your experience been there?
Yeah, I mean, like we have so we have 3 different products. We have tobacco, alcohol, and opioids, and so we deal with.
Well, those are not your products, but the products you find, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like the programs, exactly. So luckily we don't have those products, but we have like a variety of members, and like some of them are more interested in the human part of the program and understanding, that they're not on this island alone, but have some level of support, some level of expertise supporting them. And there's a correlation of if we can get some of our members to interact with their coach about 6+ times, then they're more likely to be successful in the long term. But then that's completely different to another cohort who absolutely hate interacting with anyone and just don't want to socialize their addiction because it's something that's stigmatized for them. It's something that they're not comfortable opening up about. And for them, it's much more interacting with our self-paced content. So getting them to a certain number of sessions can drive them towards that successful North Star. And so like we never end up with like a single like North Star that drives us towards that KPI. But then we do end up cohorting members, which is what we found has been the most helpful, is once we start to understand that this person's coming in with high intent, with a pretty like severe end of the addiction spectrum, and they're not interested in kind of interacting with anyone, then we kind of tailor that experience of like onboarding them to the right features.
Because otherwise you alienate them, right?
Exactly.
If you're like, you have to see a coach, you're like, I don't want to tell anyone about this because it's awkward. Yeah, I could totally see that. That's powerful.
Exactly, yeah. And in terms of, I guess, like the mistake on like metrics as well, to the previous question, you know, we previously had a metric around care team satisfaction. So that was our care team is like our team of coaches, counselors, doctors, and like the aim of that squad was focused on how do we drive up satisfaction to like an NPS score of like 60 or 70. And what we realized we were building is like features that were great for our providers, but didn't end up in like impacting our member outcomes. And so what they, as like a business cost, our coaches, counselors, they obviously cost us the most from a product perspective. And so when we think about things like COGS and gross margins, like really now we're kind of switching focus, and now we're like, we need to drive efficiency within these teams, so we can't be increasing their calls with members from 20 minutes to 40 minutes. We actually want to go in the opposite direction. And that change is obviously going to have some internal resistance, but it's kind of that storytelling piece of how do you get people to understand the narrative, and there's going to be early adopters to that, and using that as case studies to translate that to the wider group.
So have you had any weird or unexpected insights in your experience implementing metrics?
So there's one thing we've been really focused on recently is getting people to their first workout. I guess it's not a weird one, but it's perhaps not been the behavior we expected. We're really struggling, I think, not struggling, but we haven't cracked like what our activation event, which is the aha moment for our product is yet. Our belief is if you get people to their first workout, you'll then get them continuing to move. So we just recently shipped a feature which was all about getting people to their first workout. It's had great success. We've seen the numbers moving, but it hasn't got anyone to their second workout.
So that's interesting.
We don't have an answer yet, really, as to why. And there's a question like, you know, do you continue now? Okay, we've gotten to 1. How do we get into 2? And we continue kind of iterating on that path, which makes sense. Sounds logical. Or actually, are we looking at this back to front? I don't know the answer yet. One thing I think we do know is that people who are successful on our product typically have built all their intent outside the product. So they've engaged with the brand.
Committed before the year starts.
So when they hit pay and they come in, they already know like I'm going to change my life and I'm going to do this. And then you see that in the data. You can see them going through. So I think we certainly haven't cracked that question yet.
So how would you go about thinking more process-wise than answer-wise? Implementing something you mentioned earlier about being guilty, where there's self-organized Facebook groups. You're kind of looking at the metrics and success is kind of happening to you instead of driving it proactively all the time. How would you go about trying to figure out those kind of cohorts? Like, would it be worthwhile for you to say, let's identify the people who have one workout and then drop off and try to understand their perspective? Or does that not make sense at your scale?
No, I think it does. I think it absolutely does. We're in the middle of a bunch of customer interviews now. And again, it's been a huge reminder of just how much more insight you get from that versus, even though, again, we have hundreds of Facebook comments, hundreds of Instagram comments, like it's still a completely different level, I think, when you're engaging in a conversation with someone. So absolutely, I think you mentioned this, like working out the cohorts is really, really key. Splitting it all out. There's no point looking at blended numbers like that. You've got to break it down. And for us, that means, again, ability, time of year, all those kind of key things we know influences someone's behavior. And then both segmenting your quant data, but also then going and having the conversations with those people. So I think we actually made the decision. That's where we're going to go next. We are going to go and talk to people who engaged with the feature, did the one workout, and then dropped off, and try and understand more why.
It's cool. It reminds me of a conversation I had a little while ago where I explained to someone that the human mind differentiates between things and people. And an example of that is if you're in a car and someone cuts you off, you will shout and curse at them, right? Because it's a thing. There are no social instincts driving your interaction. Someone cuts you off on a sidewalk, you're like, oh, excuse me. Very different behavior, right? So I imagine those in-person interviews drive a lot of that instinctual reaction in our brain of, hey, this is a human being and I have empathy for them. Whereas a text comment doesn't give you that. So I imagine, Sarim, that for you, that might be the most difficult challenge to get that type of feedback, because talking to people who are going through this kind of program, who also have privacy aspects and everything going on, can be more challenging, I imagine, than when you're working in one of the other fields here. So how do you deal with that? Is that at all possible? Or do you work for your providers? How do you get that information?
Yeah, I mean, Reddit has been our biggest source of members, actually.
That's awesome.
And
Yeah.
there are, groups that have hundreds of thousands of members who are very comfortable talking about their addiction, talking about the experiences that they've gone through. But again, it's quite challenging because that is, like what we realized, a cohort of members who have a specific journey. They've gone through treatment already, or they're about to go through treatment. So that intent and motivation is already there. And really the bigger opportunity for us is, how do we appeal to the people who deny having an issue in the first place, who aren't interested in a treatment solution, don't even know what unhealthy looks like. And so it's thinking about, how do we reach those members and understand what's going to appeal to them, and find the hook for them. And I think that's a piece of work that we probably haven't got too far in, and really we need to kind of dive in further. We have a view on where we need to go, but we've made a lot of mistakes. We kind of early on in the product journey, we're just throwing features at the problem and just trying to figure out,
Let's see
if
what
we
sticks.
add a community feature, will that end up kind of driving retention, driving kind of engagement, and eventually cohorting members into a couple of different options, from very disappointed to somewhat disappointed, not disappointed, in terms of use of the product, was probably the biggest factor in kind of getting us to somewhat product market fit, is knowing that you're not going to appeal to every single user of the program,
You
but
can't
there is
please everyone, especially in products.
exactly you just need a group that absolutely love the product, and that's kind of the aim, which is kind of a bit of a mindset shift.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We really struggle with that question, I think, because we're a mass market brand. Joe is somewhat of a household name in the UK, so we attract, particularly in the UK, all sorts of people. But then we've got the super fans and the power users who are very vocal, have lots of feedback, and trying to. I think it was one of the first Pinterest PMs who always said, your power users are not your next 10,000 users. I always think about that, but then I'm also like, bloody hell, these guys love the product and they're all renewing into their third year. How the hell do we keep them satisfied? We've got a small team. Trying to juggle that is, if anyone's got any answers to that, I'd love to.
And I mean, an interesting story that we had early on was, we also had a community feature, and it was forum based, very similar to Reddit, and we had kind of probably 200, 300,000 people interacting with it, and really power users who were kind of guardians of that community. And there was a bit of a hunch on my side of, really, does this community drive North Star outcomes? Is it driving us towards our key goal, or are people kind of interacting with it but not actually getting value? And so we ended up just A/B testing it and removing that community feature. And what we found is the group that didn't have community ended up being more successful at getting to their addiction goals. And
that's surprising, right?
Exactly, yeah. And what our hunch was is that people who were on the community side of the feature, they ended up interacting with the community, but not interacting with the other features that actually created the behavior change. Wow. It ended up being a distraction to their other features. And
so instead of actually using the journey, they just used the community as if it was a Reddit almost.
Exactly, yeah. And leaning upon others who are basically going through the same journey as you are.
But not as qualified.
Exactly, they don't have the qualification of understanding what you really need to change that behavior, and it ended up being more of a distraction than a help. And
that's fascinating.
We had to go through a process of
that is so cool.
removing
what
that.
A surprise finding. That's good on you for A/B testing that and trying that out. That's a bold move, absolutely. Cool. So I think, are we aiming to be done at 45, or do we steal a bit of more time?
No, I mean, I think we're aiming to be down at 45 after.
Okay, cool. So in that case, there's a few questions I just wanted to get in there as well one of the popular topics that a lot of people in the industry are talking about is, hey, we just came out of the lockdowns, the whole COVID situation, and there have been multiple points of surprise behavior, right? In the beginning, it was like, take Peloton, for example. They suddenly went, holy crap, we're selling more of those than we can even produce. Business went booming. Then lockdown ended and they collapsed. And we've seen that in grocery delivery and a lot of other different areas where there was this trend line where it quickly jumped up and it kind of went back to trends, which is fascinating behavior in itself. But it's definitely had an impact on a lot of people. So how is that with working out? Were there a lot of people working out at home and now they're at the bar again? Or what kind of behavior have you seen?
We can't complain.
That's good.
COVID, people can't go to gyms. Home workouts, we're a home workout app.
And did that change their behavior in the long term?
I think, when we say long term, so coming out of COVID, I'd say we haven't really seen a shift. There's no signals in our data that's saying that. But again, I think it goes back to the type of user we attract.
Mm-hmm.
Most of our audience are at the start of their fitness journey. They find gyms overwhelming.
Yeah.
They find them intimidating. They're embarrassed to go to the gym. So actually a home workout product is perfect for them. They can do it in the privacy of their own home. So again, it goes back to where we started today, I guess, that context, stepping back and looking at that. So we were fortunate to see, the brand was growing prior to COVID. The app launched in the middle of COVID, saw great growth. Pee with Joe also happened during COVID, which some of you may have heard of, which also had a positive impact. And then out of the other side now, longer term, I'd say we haven't seen a decline.
Oh, good. That's a good position to be in.
Yeah, can't complain.
Definitely blindsided some companies. So, yeah, good on you. So, Søren, how's that been for you? Have you seen any change in behavior in like that 2 years and the year after?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say like addiction is pretty stigmatized, and so like no one really wants to go to traditional treatment options that are face-to-face anyways, and explaining to your employer why you're taking 7 days out of work, 30 days out of work without explaining the reason why is pretty challenging. So the fact that we are a digital solution adds a level of discretion to the treatment that just opens up a new possibility. Where it's probably had the most effect is from a customer's point of view. Customers often offer traditional treatment options, and healthcare is generally quite slow moving in adopting new technologies. And so when COVID hit, they realized that all these face-to-face services couldn't work anymore. And so they were looking for digital solutions. And that was kind of where we cropped up, as like they needed a digital solution to replace a lot of the traditional treatment services. And now coming out of COVID, it's a case of like we've presented the data that shows that we're, attracting more people, getting them to more successful goals. And as a result, we're kind of here to stay. We definitely don't think it's going to be a digital-only version of healthcare like over the next decades, but I think a hybrid approach makes more sense as the longer-term solution.
Exactly. Plus, with all the strain on healthcare and everything that people are aware of, it makes more sense, right? It's almost a natural move. Cool. Robert, anything in your world where you saw weird changes happening?
I mean, I don't think, I guess because I changed from previous one, which obviously massively affected. I think the interesting thing for us now is obviously recession coming, companies looking at profitability and being in SaaS.
Yeah.
You talk to, all of these finance professionals and company owners, like the first thing they're cutting is their SaaS software because it's an easy spend and they're just going through the 20 subscriptions that they don't actually use. So I think that's a really interesting kind of thing to look at, and like all the stocks of the SaaS companies are tanking now as well. So I think it's a really interesting thing to kind of keep an eye on if you're building SaaS software. What is your revenue model, and can you provide real value rather than being the 27 different things that a company has for no reason, because it's the easiest one to cut. I think for them, as they, everyone go through the spreadsheet. That's why people like Vendor, etc., are doing really well now by just saying you shouldn't be spending that money on that. You've got 40 licenses when you need 12. So I think that's just kind of an interesting thing we've found, and it's an interesting challenge building SaaS software when everyone's cutting it. So
cool.
We'll see.
Well, I think we have pretty much ended our time for this session. So let me first thank our panelists. We really appreciate you being here. And I'm sure they're willing to stick around for a minute or two if anyone has any questions.
Hi, I'm just really interested in that kind of subscription model that you've got with the Body Coach, and it's really interesting to hear you talk about the success beyond the commercial and trying to encourage those customers into that, first workout and beyond. So just a little bit more around what those other metrics might be as well. So obviously subscription revenue is a driver, but that change to your customers' kind of well-being and how you measure that as well. It's really interesting to hear that you'd think it would be a commercial focus only, and actually if they're not using it,
So we are the total opposite. Before our head of finance arrived, our founders are incredibly purpose-driven. It's what they're in the game for. It's what they do. To the detriment of the business, where we're like, right, we need to start talking about the commercials a little bit more. So Ed arrived and has put a very strong lens on that. But what that has meant is there is a lot of conversation, not only about revenue, retention, acquisition, but also around impact. So we have a number of impact metrics, and our North Star is about moving people through cycles, specifically 3 cycles. A cycle is 4 weeks, and you're given workouts each week, and you're given food for that 4 weeks, a meal plan rather. And we're trying to ultimately get people there, and then we're working backwards from that. So we're looking at, are they working out? We also track something we call NSVs, non-scale victories. So when you check in, how do you feel? Does your mood feel better? Are you feeling more confident about yourself? So there's a number of questions we ask at that point. But I think the thing I'm proud of is we don't just track that for no reason. We talk about it a lot in our business. And the founders are the first to ask me, they're like, stop talking about retention for a minute. How are we doing on getting people to work out? Which I think is a really fortunate place to be.
Yeah, and it's great to see that kind of value driving through the product and continuing now it's in that position as well. So it's good to hear.
Any other questions in the audience? They'll be leaving soon, so make the most of it.
Well, I'll ask a second question. So you were talking a little bit about how you have in a B2B2C type of model, right? You have the end goal, the consumer that you're impacting, and in your case, it's the patient that you're impacting. But then the company that you're selling to, the person who's purchasing, obviously they care about cost efficiencies, et cetera. And I'm personally interested in this because I work in a B2B2C company. I try to talk to as many founders and people about this. When you've gone through your journey of how you speak about impact, how helpful is it when you talk to the insurance companies about the consumer impact? Like, how much of that narrative is in the pitch to the insurance company versus how much is it just about cost efficiencies?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in a fortunate position where our B2C goals and our B2B goals align probably 90% of the time, and 10% is like a way up. And the reason that is because outcomes from a patient's point of view, like getting them to quit smoking leads to a significant dollar cost saving for our employers. And so like where they care most about is like, I guess like the scientific research, like have we got published studies, like are we a scaled up solution that can be trusted to take on board like the 100,000 employees that they're serving today. And I think that's where they care most about. And then they love to get into the details and probably too much into the demo experience and make suggestions on the product itself. There's obviously times when we do need to make calls on what's best for our clients versus what's best for our members. But luckily, like because they align pretty well in terms of that outcome data can ladder up to certain like dollars being saved. That makes our jobs a little bit easier compared to probably other businesses in the B2B world.
Okay. All right, let's call it a day and get some drinks. Thank you, everyone.